There we go. What's all you, Billy?
Okay, hi everyone. I'm not sure if I don't see everybody. I need to work on that, don't I? Fix that in the little grid thing there. There we go. I can see faces now. The adventure of e-learning in 2022 is knowing who's here and where you're, what you're doing and what your interests are. I am in Tennessee and we're between storms, so I hope that the internet will stay connected and everything will be good. But would you care to put in the chat just sort of where you're from so we can get an idea of where our folks are and what your interest in metacognitive experiences are? Just a couple of words like student, educator, whatever, kind of an introduction. And as that goes, I will tell you that I am very interested in this concept because I have worked in adult education for many years, mostly in the career technical side of things. And in that environment, we have a challenge that a lot of subject matter experts are hired to teach in post-secondary education, and they don't understand cognitive development. They don't understand the necessity of transforming learners intellectually, not just skill sets or not just raw knowledge, but transforming them. And so that's where my interest came from. I call this, I know what I know, because once a student achieves that transformation, and I'm sorry, I'm old school, I still say student instead of learner. Once a student achieves metacognitive transformation, they know they have it. It's a light bulb moment, aha moment. Different people call it different things, but they become aware of their learning. They know how they know it, why they know it, and what they're going to do with it. And that's what metacognition, personal epistemology, self-agency, and sustainable change mean. We're moving toward the sustainable change. There's some definitions I wanted to give you if you're not familiar with it. Oh, and I will also tell you in the Discord channel for presentations, I already uploaded my slides and I uploaded an article that I highly encourage you to read that will sort of go along with this. Personal epistemology, if you're not familiar with the term, means my knowing, my understanding of what my perspective is about my learning. And we pretty much all, if you're in higher education, you know what epistemology means. We hear it all the time. But my personal ownership of my knowledge of my learning and my aim for my learning and everything with it is my personal epistemology. And that comes from these metacognitive moments. Until a learner has that, oh my gosh, they don't even understand what a personal epistemology is. And our role as educators is to guide them to see it happening. And that's where I'm hoping to get to today. When they have that moment of metacognitive awareness, they become agents of their own learning. And self-agency has a lot of components I'm going to talk about. You may have heard, if you've read Bandura, you know about self-agency, and a lot of other people have written about it, but it has a different meaning to every student. And if you're mentoring students, it will have a different meaning to you for each of us mentor-mentee relationships. Obviously, we're going to talk about transformative learning, and most folks know Jack Mesereau is credited with being the father of transformative learning. But he, if you go back to Habermas and some of the others that preceded that, where he got his foundation, it's really fascinating to watch the transformation of his transforming learning theory. So I encourage you to do that. Also, I want to talk a little bit about the cognitive and intellectual development of adult learners. Epistemological epiphany is that moment where they become aware. They say, oh my goodness. And I'll give you the best example I've had recently is talking with a young lady who is getting her certification to be a legal assistant. And she knew everything she'd learned in class, but she went out to her internship and they gave her a task to do, and she went, "Oh, I know how to do this. I didn't know I knew how to do this until I was faced with the responsibility of performing that task." That was her aha moment. And I started asking her, "Well, how did you get to that point?" And she couldn't really tell me. She just said, "I knew." She just sort of knew it. And so then I started peeling away, like, me as a teacher, I want to know, how did you get here? And she finally realized that it happened while she wasn't looking, basically. She developed the skills and they congealed in that space before her internship, but she didn't have to draw on it until she was in the internship experience. So if you take the epistemological epiphany and put it with metacognitive awareness, which is what I just described, she knew that she understood. She had agency over her learning at that point for the rest of her internship and for the rest of her college experience. She became controlling of her destiny, basically, as a learner, and she's about to graduate. I'm so proud of her. We've stayed in touch. It's been a challenge because she was in non-traditional, which this happens a lot more in non-traditional students than we think it would, because non-traditional students are typically more mature, and we expect on many levels that they'll have a higher level of cognitive development. That's not necessarily the case. If you're not familiar with Carol Kasmar's writing, I highly recommend that you read her. She's an awesome researcher and author. Cognitive and intellectual development, I've got a couple of things just for sort of reminders if you're not familiar with it, or if you are familiar with it on a different level. In the world of cognitive development, there's an argument. Some folks say it should be the central focus of what we do as educators. Others say, well, we shouldn't focus on it. We should focus more on skills. We should focus more on knowledge. We should focus more on social change. But there's a whole world of cognitive development expertise that says this is where our focus should be. And if you take classes like in this particular conference we're in, or other Center for Teaching Excellence projects that they advertise in your school, or if you have the opportunity to take some in another school, like Cornell has edX, as well as lots of universities do, but Cornell's edX presentations are really awesome. I highly recommend those as well, because you'll get the opportunity to talk about intellectual and cognitive development with people who deal with this as teaching excellence professionals all the time. And most of those are free, which is extraordinary. Anyway, when they're developing their personal epistemologies, early students, the freshmen or the bridging to sophomore to junior, when they're starting to become more academically mature, they have a more fixed identity, the younger ones do, regardless of their age. And when I say young, I mean like freshmen, sophomores. They have a more fixed identity of their academic selves, their knowledge of who they are. They're still in a place of the knowledge I'm receiving is what matters. My personal knowledge is not as important as parroting back the information that I'm given, getting an A in this class. I don't really have to think about it. I just receive and regurgitate, basically. So it's more fixed. Now, if they're fortunate enough to be in an environment in their programs where they're encouraged to develop personal cognition or develop some sort of EQ, emotional intelligence, that helps. And we have a program at UC in the College of Engineering, the honors program, where I'm working with a student who is there, and we're talking about how do you get more EQ in these honors kids who are honors students who are coming in, and help them to make that jump earlier in their programs. Then another challenge in developing personal epistemology in higher education is a lot of the instructors and most of the students don't understand the principles of adult learning. And everybody credits Malcolm Knowles with those, but he took a lot of information and pulled it together, and it's been added to since then. And if you're not familiar with him, it's Knowles, Malcolm Knowles. I encourage you to read those. He is credited with 6 of the principles, but people have added to that over time. And basically, the top ones when it comes to epistemology, personal epistemology, are being ready to learn and knowing what you need to learn and deriving self-direction, knowing what you need to learn and how you need to learn it. So those 2 are the primary principles for this concept. Independence is crucial. And that, again, is a matter of emotional and physical, in some cases, maturity that happens at some point. And that's a whole other, like, you can take an entire course in that. So we won't get into it today. And then when learners become aware of their self-mastery, we kind of think we know what it is, but we don't really have a concept of it because it's so personalized. I don't look at my self-mastery the way someone else would. If I'm happy with this level, that's my self-mastery. So no amount of mentoring, no amount of cajoling will push me past that. I have to be ready for it. I have listed a few of the primary theories behind personal epistemology. Hofer and Pinchurch are the main ones who came up with the first actual published paper that brought all this together. And what it is views about knowledge and knowing, which we talked about before, and about the nature of learning. And they, as I mentioned, the quote here pretty much covers what I mentioned before. It has to be a personal, has to be something that they come to on their own. I don't know, well, I don't have everybody's faces, but I would love to know how many of you actually mentor students who are at that transitional stage or coming along and wanting to know more about growth as an intellectual, you know, there may be freshmen, sophomores, and you're trying to develop, or if most of you are in the point of working with older students. Oh, I got one up. Okay. There's a wonderful, if you have the opportunity to go out and find this paper, Bendix and Rule came up with this graphic that describes how personal epistemology actually develops. And it's very mechanical in their outline and their drawing. But if you'll notice, it's recursive as well as moving forward. And that's going to be something we'll talk about in a few minutes. But it happens affective, it happens intellectually, it happens at every level of their development with their students. We have, you know, the 3 domains: cognitive, psychomotor, and affective domain. And it's got to be in all 3. Then to move into transformative learning, we know everybody tells us that's the goal of adult learning is transformation. And that's a whole concept. If you're not familiar with it, it's amazing. And I highly encourage you to read more. The quote that I've got here is one of the foundational quotes for this presentation. Sharon Merriam said, "You have to be at a mature level of cognitive functioning to engage in transformation." So until students have hit that point of metacognitive awareness and personal epistemology, they're not going to be able to transform as learners. That's her position. And most of the literature, what empirical studies exist, support that. Now I want to branch off just a little bit. I don't know how much you all know about William Perry and his scheme of, he called it an odd name, intellectual, and the title of it, sorry, my brain is gone right now. Anyway, Perry's scheme is 9 stages. I'm trying to remember the title of the book, and I apologize. Anyway, the idea behind Perry was that students come into learning at a particular level of intellectual development, and they mature throughout their learning. And that foundational research was done in the 1950s at Harvard with me, where there were about 450 or 500 men that they studied. And what's really intriguing is that very limited population, people have followed up on it, they have expanded on it. There's a whole list there of authors who have derived other theories from Perry's original theme of intellectual and ethical development. They have never said this was wrong, except there was a Chinese study by Zhang that said, oh, this doesn't work in China. And they didn't think it worked in the United States either. But most of the folks have said this works. And the reason it's important as a foundation for what I'm talking about today is Perry came up with the concept of development and stages of development. This is a real quick rundown of 4 of the stages out of the 9. These are the overarching stages. And you'll notice that dualism says facts only right or wrong. That's how most students come into higher education. This is what I've got to do. Like I said, I've got to take it in, regurgitate it, and move on to the next class. And then they get to the point where they say, well, you know, there might be some other opinions, and I will listen to those. Those are either going to come from mentors, students in their cohort, or social environments. And today we have a lot more social learning than we did when this sort of study was taking place. Relativism gives the student the opportunity to say, you know, obviously it refers to everything as relative, but I start to reason why I believe what I do and what information is coming in, and I'm able to parse it as it comes in. And then the commitment stage says, I know I've got to make some choices about my learning. I've got to make some choices about my belief in learning. And I've got to move forward once I've got that commitment. And it's an intellectual commitment, not a psychosocial commitment. Oh, my page down. What happened? I can't tell if I'm locked up. It's not paging down. Oh, there we go. And again, I apologize, I'm in a different environment. The foundations of all this, obviously, is in psychology. And I've got 2 graphics that I borrowed from other sources. The self is made up of several different segments, and some of y'all may already have this. And then on the left-hand side, we've got self of metacognitive transformation. Self-concept and self-esteem are components. And a lot of folks get it confused. They think that these are all similar, but they're really not. My concept of myself may be high, but I may have low self-esteem. My self-awareness may be high, but I have a low self-concept. So you have to sort of find the sweet spot for all of them in order for students to make that transition. We deal with what people tell us about ourselves. Even though we think we have a great idea of who we are, we still listen to what people tell us. And that's on Perry's dualism stage, the very first one I was talking about. Then we learn how to form judgments about ourselves. Our self-esteem, our self-concept starts to adjust based on how others act toward us and how we act toward others and how we're responded to. Now think about that. That sort of sounds like a social experience. Think about it in a classroom. If you've got a learner in the classroom who is making that transition to relativism, who is saying, oh, I get it now. I don't have to just sit here and be a sponge and regurgitate it back. I need to pay attention to what cues I'm getting from other students. I need to pay attention to cues from my instructors. I need to go out and talk to advisors or even sit at the library and talk to the library specialist about my topic. I'm going to be more of a relative learner. Then we have what we call witnessing outcomes. Once the learners begin to consider the outcomes of their actions, they are ready to make that metacognitive leap. And that lines up with Perry's commitment stage. So I want to go just a little bit into self-efficacy for those of you who aren't really familiar with it, because it is fundamental to self-agency. And self-agency, as I've built up to, is part of the metacognitive process. If you don't have a high level of self-efficacy, you're not going to be able to persist as well. It won't be easy for you to persist. You'll be more reactive than proactive. Your motivation won't be there. Your students who you think are doing great may not be doing great because they have this sense of low self-efficacy that you don't see in the classroom. And or if you're in a mentoring situation where you're working one-on-one with them, they may be able to, what we call in the South, shine you on. And you think they're doing great, but their self-efficacy is really suffering. And the biggest thing to remember as educators is there is no single measure of self-efficacy. It can change in every individual sometimes on a daily basis. It depends on how fragile that person is emotionally or physically that affects their intellectual development. With learners, we're aiming for self-agency that gives them the ability to discern the material that they're learning. Can they balance? Can they make connections contextually, not just strictly receive it and regurgitate it? Can they make critical thinking, contextual decisions? Is it holistic? That's why the reason that's so big on the screen is holistic experience is crucial to self-agency. Like I talked about, physical, social, intellectual, emotional, it has to all be there for self-agency to settle in. And once all this happens, then the students become proactive. Does anybody have a question? I know I'm going quickly, but if anybody has a question, please call her and raise your hand or however you signal. I'm happy to stop and back up or stop and give some examples of things. I grabbed this slide graphic from an article that I uploaded to the Discord channel. It's recent, 2020. Someone actually did a study on online self-efficacy, and I thought that was really extraordinary to see. So it's relevant to what we're talking about today. And what he talked about in the online education world is all of these different factors affect self-efficacy. So in a traditional classroom setting or a face-to-face mentoring setting, we don't have online infrastructure. We don't have the social influence. We don't have that. We have a specific learning and teaching experience. So please read the article if you have the opportunity. He, in his study, he found that role modeling, verbal persuasion, and he's not a native English speaker, I don't think, so some of the spelling is creative, but I love the graphics. Role modeling, verbal persuasion, and self-mastery are crucial to self-efficacy in online education. And remember, we've got to have self-efficacy before we can get to the personal epistemology and a metacognitive transformation. So if you're an instructor and you're in a class setting online, you've got to think about these things. What role modeling options are available to me and from student to student? What could I bring into the classroom from outside sources? Do I have Khan Academy? Do I have YouTube videos? Do I have other things that could maybe produce some role modeling opportunities? How do you verbally engage with your learners in the setting and outside the setting? And some folks are teaching sessions that are just huge. You may have 100 folks in your session. How do you actually work on a personal level, persuading them with your words? And then how do you coach them? It may be if you've got a large group or a very disparate group that you have a challenge of coaching. And so that may require some research and some instructional activities on your part. So I'm getting to the part that I'm really excited about, which is sustainable change. For transformation to occur, we have to have all of those foundational elements. But we're getting towards transformation. And a guy named Ross Peterson Veith, I love his model that he came up with, because he drew from Perry, and then he took Jack Mesereau's transformative learning theory and put it together and came up with this model called Stages of Sustainable Change. And the reason I think it's astounding is students can go both directions. A lot of these models, the assumption is they can only go one direction. And Ross's model, they can go backward, or they can go forward, or they can actually maybe skip one. Like they don't skip it exactly, but there's not a specific amount of time. They just say, okay, I got that, now I'm here, okay, now I'm ready to go there and learn some more. So he gives a lot more impetus to the learning experience and the exploration of their learning and the expression of their learning. So that's why I love his model. And I wanted to point out there's a lot of different theories that you can read, and these are a few of them. Intellectual dissonance, we all think it's where learning occurs, but does it? Do we have to have intellectual dissonance, or can we have what I call intellectual harmony, where you say, ooh, that is a little bit different, which is what dissonance means, but it's not dissonant. It doesn't destroy everything that's there. It's something that harmonizes and sort of folds in. And my personal opinion, I love what I call the old dudes. I like modern, post everything thought, but I really still like to go back and read the guys who were writing, and most of them were guys, who were writing in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s about adult learning and about these theories, because even Piaget, he was primarily about children's learning, but you can apply Piaget to adult learning. So for successful transfer of learning to occur, you have to have these components: cognition, which is awareness and intellectual development; metacognition, which is the knowledge of that you know or you need to know something; epistemology, which is ownership of your learning; and then the self-agency that comes from having developed that. Now I'm going to go get what I need to know. And I want to have you think about some questions, because what I'd like to, instead of a breakout, because we could break into two groups, or we could just have I'm happy with having a bigger group discussion. I want to explore your all's experiences with this in more detail and get some background that we could all possibly use. The questions that I want you to think about today are, what are the characteristics of the epiphanic moment? How do I recognize that when they're becoming aware? And how do I, as an online instructor, how do I recognize that? That's one of the primary questions. I could give you a laundry list of things, like you see their faces, you see their participation, you see it in their deliverables that they turn in. If you keep in on breakout sessions, you see that they're actually engaged. There's a lot of ways that you can do that, but how do you become aware? How do you know? That needs to become a part of your personal instructional toolbox. Then, how does metacognition of the personal epistemology affect the student's self-agency? If you understand that from yourself as a learner, go back, reflect backward on your learning. You can then apply what you gathered from your reflection to your students in the online environment, because most of us learned without the online opportunity. And when we went through the process of becoming metacognitively aware and self-agent learners, we had people, we had different support systems. We didn't have social learning environments like we do today. So how do I as an instructor recognize this, and how do I support that? Well, the best way, like I said, is to go back and reflect on how you got there, and then watch for those changes in your students. Then the last question is, cognitive intellectual development based on Perry's scheme of intellectual and ethical development, is it related to metacognitive awareness? In your observation, do you think that intellectual development actually has something to do with their metacognition? And if you feel comfortable with your personal opinion of that, you'll be able to focus on the students who have different levels of cognitive development. And that's kind of hard to explain, but if you're in a classroom setting, a face-to-face classroom setting, you can identify, because of the questions that they ask, because of their feedback, their posture, so many cues that you get as an instructor. If you're in an online environment, we don't have necessarily the opportunity for those cues. You may have somebody who asks 1,000 questions and everybody else sort of sits quietly in the corner, or you may have nobody talk. I sit in classes all the time in my graduate program at UT where nobody talks, and the professors are like, does somebody want to talk? And you're all just like, no. How do I prompt that? It's not that we aren't cognitively developed as PhD students, but the challenge is, how do you draw us out? Because we're there. So is cognitive development a requirement for metacognition? And the secret that I want to share with you is that metacognitive awareness of your personal epistemology doesn't just stop with one class or one level of your learning experience. We have it every single day in every place that we have learning. And if you're in the learning world like we are, the instructional world, we learn something every day. So that metacognitive aha moment happens every single day. And so now I want to throw it out there for discussion. How do you recognize these moments, or what has challenged you to recognize this in your students? And then can you share examples with us? And do you have questions? I don't know if you know to answer or ask. Everybody's muted, so I'm going to guess that that's an indication that nobody really has a question. Well, I had left some space for chatting, but if there aren't any questions or nobody wants to share, I will put out there, this is my contact information, and I would love to talk with anybody about this who wants to talk about it. And that's my contact details. And like I said, I uploaded this presentation slide deck and the Can-Do handout. I can refer you to a bunch of other stuff. I've got a resource list of about 400 articles on this subject that I would be happy to share if anybody's interested in that. Oh, some questions are coming in. Okay. Okay, we have, I've done per course surveys of the students to better understand their needs, background, and knowledge. That is a good way to do it, but one of my questions is always, are you familiar with the different levels of feedback and evaluation? Donald Kirkpatrick has the evaluation theory that goes with adult learning, the ISD model, ADDIE, many of you probably know that. And he had 4 levels of evaluation identified. So what I encourage folks to do is not just use one level or 2 levels. Go through all 4 levels at some point in your classes so that you get either just a smiley face or you get an actual feedback, an open-ended questionnaire where you get feedback on things, where you say, so tell me blah, and leave it open for them. And then let's flip through this. Will you make it? Yes, I did make them available. And I work with learners transitioning through emerging adulthood and have teenagers at home. Well, that is wonderful. Whoever you are, I have great respect for anybody who has teenagers. I'm working more for reflection. Tyler Watts is mentioned that he incorporates more reflection in his classes with positive gains, and he's excited to learn more. Thank you for doing that. Reflection is something we talk about, but we don't always know how to do it and how to incorporate it effectively. And it's usually a component of helping students explore their epistemology and their metacognitive development. There is some excellent material available if you don't look for reflection. If you look for some of the Perry derivatives like Baxter Magolda, the meaning-making materials, read those, and then incorporate some of that into your reflective activities, because reflection has gotten, in my personal opinion, has gotten sort of into its own little world over here. People reflect, they say they reflect, but they don't always do what I would consider a proper reflection for intellectual development by the experts. So read about meaning making, and Robert Keegan wrote about a lot of intellectual development from a different perspective. He sort of bridges the Perry scheme and the meaning making. Brad, it says metacognition is close to his heart with SEL and UDL. Good. So I'm glad that you're using it with those folks. And I think that's all the chat. So find me messages.
Ooh, I think Eileen had a question about who was that author on intellectual development?
Oh, was it Perry or was it Baxter Magolda? Or there's so many. William Perry obviously is sort of the father of the whole stages of intellectual development. Ross Patterson Veach, whose name is in the slides, if you download the slide deck, his name is in there. He came up with the stages of sustainable change model that I love so much. I can't understand, got Perry, it was the other one. Oh, I'm sorry, Ross Peterson Veach, V-E-A-T-C-H. He hasn't written a whole lot recently, but he developed this model that I am enamored with because he bridged transformation and stages of learning that Perry came up with without going into meaning making, which is where Baxter Magolda and many of the other ones went from Perry. It's kind of like building a tree, a family tree, but it's a knowledge tree. And most folks who came from Perry and worked from his original thought, moving toward intellectual development, went towards cognition and literal psychological development. And then you have the folks who came along and said, well, we're going to stick with Jack Mesereau and transformative learning. And oh, by the way, over here, we'll think about Perry and some of the intellectual stuff. So they didn't really get matched up very well until later on. Now we're using cognitive and intellectual development and reflection and mentoring and so many other course options for support for our students that we didn't use before we had e-learning as effectively, because when we had them in class, when we had the students actually in class, we could see, we could feel it, we could read their material, we would have the opportunity to chat after class, and we got a sense of where they were. Now we have to utilize all these other tools that are coming, like I said, not from the world of instructional design. They're not necessarily coming from the world of Centers for Teaching Excellence. They're coming from a combination of all of it. And so you really have to go kind of build your own toolbox, I guess is a good way to put it. Yes, Ross Peterson Beach, and then meaning make Dexter. I'm not familiar with Dexter. Meaning making, most folks think of, here, I'll type it in, Baxter Magolda. That's her name. She was one of the first people who wrote about meaning making in education. So I guess to conclude, to make sure that we're going to do what we always do in education, I'm going to tell you what we talked about. We have to have the foundational information. You have to understand how metacognition occurs. You have to have the understanding of intellectual development as an instructor. And then you're going to have to take the clues and cues from your learners that are a challenge in online learning. But there are methods. And the Kundu article that I uploaded, he talks about some of those things that he found in his empirical study of self-efficacy in online learning. So you have to put that in your toolbox. And then you need to develop your own personal methods. And that comes from your reflection of your metacognitive moments. You have to develop your tools that you can use to recognize in your online students change is about to occur. And that's why I call it emerging transformation. Once you have those tools in place, and once you're aware that it's happening, you as an instructor can grab hold and guide that student or that group of students to the next level. You can say, hey, I've got this. I see where you're headed. I see where you may be stumbling, and guide them to that next level of intellectual and cognitive development that they need to achieve self-agency. I'll type into the chat, by the way, if you're not familiar with the self-agency, it's Bandura, Albert Bandura. He wrote most of the early stuff about learner self-agency. So, any other questions or comments in the chat? We're just about on our ending time, and I thank you for being here. And again, if you have any other questions, please feel free to send them to me, and I will more than happily answer and send you as much as I can on this topic.
Thank you so much for your time today. This was such a wonderful way of encapsulating a lot of different thoughts I have in that space. So really appreciate it, and hope everybody has a chance to fill out the survey, the session evaluation at the end. Billie, really appreciate your time. I will stop the recording at this point because I think that'll do for the recording. There you go.